everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Megan Spencer, and I'm a Research and Communications Assistant for the POLIS Water Sustainability Project, which is based at the University of Victoria, and I will be the host of today's session. So today's webinar, Awash with Opportunity, Ensuring the Sustainability of BC's New Water Law, is the third webinar in POLIS's 2015-2016 Creating a Blue Dialogue webinar series, which is now in its 6th season. And our next session will explore needs and strategies for strengthening watershed governance in British Columbia, and will take place in March. And we'll be circulating the details of that session in the coming weeks, so stay tuned for details on that. And I know some of you have attended our webinars in the past, but for those of you who haven't, I wanted to give you some insight into the Creating a Blue Dialogue series. So its goal is to bring together water leaders and practitioners in one virtual space to engage with emerging and priority issues in water policy and water governance. And this webinar, as I hope you're all aware, our two speakers will share insights from recent POLIS research on British Columbia's new Water Sustainability Act, and they will outline the core regulations needed to bring the Act's sustainable aspects into full effect. And this webinar is also intended to build on POLIS's January 2014 publication, A Blueprint for Watershed Governance in British Columbia, which focused on 9 winning conditions needed to move towards a more sophisticated approach to watershed governance. And we couldn't carry out this series without the support of our various partners. All of them are listed here on this slide. I want to say a big thank you to all of them for their core support to this series, and to highlight the support of Water Canada magazine, who is our media sponsor. I'd also like to foreshadow an upcoming water issues contest, which we'll be hosting in partnership between POLIS and the Canadian Freshwater Alliance, called What's Your Water Problem? What's Your Solution? So in the contest, we'll invite organizations and First Nations across British Columbia, so likely many of you attending today's discussion, to submit a short description of the most pressing freshwater issue in your watershed and your proposed solution to the problem. And the top submission will receive $500 to put towards programs, plus research support from POLIS to identify up to 3 strategies to move towards the solution to your water issue, as well as a 1-hour coaching call with Canadian Freshwater Alliance on a strategy to elevate your issue in the media. And Rosie, my colleague here at POLIS, will be circulating the invitation when we launch the contest in the coming weeks. But if you do have any initial questions about the contest, you can contact her at water@polisproject.org. And before I hand things over to the speakers, there's just a few housekeeping items I'd like to run through with you. So the first has to do with audio. As I'm sure you've all realized, I have a blanket mute on everyone. Since we're expecting over 100 listeners today, this means we shouldn't have any audio feedback to distract us from the presentations, which might raise the question, well, how do we deal with questions? And I see that many of you are using the chat box in the bottom right corner of your screen. So after Oliver and Rosie are finished presenting, that's where we'll handle questions. And I'll serve as the moderator and read them out as they come in, and the speakers will be able to answer them. And the final housekeeping item I'd like to share with you is that now I think is a nice opportunity for you to introduce yourself in the chat box, maybe give a weather update from your region. It's just a nice way to get a sense of the community in the room, since we're all scattered across the country or across BC. It's nice to get to know who's in this virtual space. So if you could say who you are, what organization you're with, and how many folks are listening with you, that should help us feel a bit more like a community. And now I'd like to introduce today's speakers, 2 of my colleagues at the POLIS project. So Oliver Brandis is the co-director of the Center for Global Studies POLIS project on ecological governance at the University of Victoria and lead of the POLIS Water Sustainability Project. He's a founding member of the national expert group, the Forum for Leadership on Water, which he currently co-chairs, and he serves as an advisor to numerous other national, provincial, and more local water organizations and funders. And Oliver is currently a technical advisor to the BC Ministry of Environment, supporting the ongoing development of the Water Sustainability Act, and he was a member of the Water Advisory Committee and the Council of the Federation. And Rosie Sims is also joining us as a speaker. And Rosie is the Water Law and Policy Researcher / Coordinator with the POLIS Water Sustainability Project at the University of Victoria. In February 2015, Rosie completed her master's degree at the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability at the University of British Columbia, where her research explored histories and interactions between First Nations and water governance in British Columbia. And of course, Oliver and Rosie were co-authors of POLIS's November 2015 publication, Awash with Opportunity, Ensuring the Sustainability of British Columbia's New Water Law, along with Deborah Curran and Savannah Carr-Wilson. And so with that introduction to the webinar and to our speakers, it's my pleasure to hand things over to our first speaker, Rosie. So Rosie, you'll just need to press *6 on your phone in order to speak.
Perfect. Thank you, Megan, and hello everyone from sunny Victoria. And thanks to you all for being here today. It's great to see lots of familiar names in the chat box there and many new ones as well. So as Megan mentioned, our webinar today is based off a recent research report that POLIS released that provides an analysis of BC's new Water Sustainability Act and sets out some key actions for regulation development. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion with you today. So just to give a quick roadmap of how the presentation today is going to flow, I'll start us off with a bit more background on this research project, and I'll provide some context on the escalating water issues here in BC, and then provide an overview of some of the steps that have been taken since 2008 to update BC's water law. Then I'm going to pass things over to Oliver, and he will walk us through some legislative history and the big picture of what the new Water Sustainability Act offers BC, and what some of the new opportunities it presents are, as well as some of the overarching issues and points of concern. And then together we're going to talk through some detail on 4 key regulation areas in the new Water Sustainability Act. So up front, here's 3 takeaway messages from today's presentation. In case you remember nothing else, hopefully these points can stick with you. The first point here is that BC's freshwater is under pressure, and the existing provincial water law and management tools are not adequate to deal with the complexity and growing magnitude of these challenges. The second point is that the new Water Sustainability Act does have many promising features that can better protect BC's freshwater, but its effectiveness is ultimately going to depend on both the right regulations that have yet to be developed and fully implementing the Act. And the third point here is that the POLIS team has identified these 5 core regulation areas that will really ensure that the sustainability gets put in the Water Sustainability Act. And these 5 core areas are groundwater, environmental flows, monitoring and reporting, water objectives, as well as planning and governance. So again, this webinar is based off this new major report that we released last November. And this was a year-long research project really undertaken with the purpose of informing the Water Sustainability Act implementation and regulation development phase. And you'll see the full team of authors up on the slide here. This report does have a very strong legal focus, and indeed 3 of these authors bring expertise in Canadian water law. My background is more on the watershed planning and governance side, so that's the perspective I am bringing to this work. So coming back to square one here, why should we all care about water at all? And of course, this really comes as no surprise, but clean and abundant water is fundamentally important for sustaining both human and ecological communities, sustaining everything from food production to healthy fish and aquatic ecosystems. The second point is that freshwater is not only valuable and finite, it's also under pressure and in serious trouble in many regions of the world. So in its 2015 annual Global Risks Report, the World Economic Forum ranked water crises as the top global risk the world is facing today. So clearly water issues are of growing global concern and matter to all of us, not just a few of us here in BC. So looking at British Columbia then, we see that it has its own set of water-related issues and challenges, and there's many different pressures on both water quality and water availability in BC, including some of the very familiar suspects up there on the slide, including climate change and associated changing hydrological patterns, population growth, as well as growing and competing demands for water. In some areas, water has been fully, if not over-allocated. So in the South Okanagan, for instance, about 240 of 300 streams are now fully allocated, meaning that no more licenses can be granted on them. And certainly the drought of last summer was a wake-up call in much of the province, with historical low snowpacks in some areas and unprecedented hot and dry conditions in many regions, with many areas placed in a prolonged stage 4 drought. And watersheds across the province are now really clearly showing signs of stress from these mounting pressures. So certainly from the introductory question we asked, it's clear that many of you are seeing these concerns in your own watersheds. So issues around water quality, over-allocation, conflicts between users, etc. So the map up on this slide really forms the basis of our report. And what it shows is different water issues and conflicts in BC that have been documented in both media stories as well as environmental appeal board cases. And these key issue areas are again kind of grouped into 5 categories, and these are groundwater, environmental flows, monitoring and reporting, planning and governance, and water objectives. So just to highlight a few outstanding examples of some of the stories that appear as dots on the map there. So in Langley, the aquifer that provides about 80% of the township's water has been declining by about 30 centimeters per year for the past 30 years. And this has been linked both to increasing demand and thousands of forgotten artesian wells pumping millions of gallons of groundwater to the surface each year. Here on Vancouver Island, the Cowichan River has had such low flows in recent years that salmon have actually had to be moved upstream by truck in order to spawn. So all of these issues captured on the map, and of course the many more that are not portrayed here, really point to the real need for new approaches to water management and changes to the supporting laws in British Columbia. And this is really why it's so important that the new Water Sustainability Act is fully implemented in order to provide the tools that we need to manage and govern these increasingly complex water issues and challenges. So that was a very quick overview of the big picture of why water and water law reform matter right now in BC. And so I'm going to briefly touch on the steps that have been taken since 2008 to update BC's water laws. The 2008 Living Water Smart Plan was really the first step on the path to creating BC's new water law. And this plan sets out the province's commitment to make sure that British Columbia's water stays healthy now and into the future. Living Water Smart contains 45 specific action commitments and targets, and this includes the commitment to modernize water laws by 2012. So the Water Sustainability Act is both a direct outcome of Living Water Smart, and it also follows through on a number of those 45 specific action commitments, and that includes the commitments to regulate groundwater as well as protect environmental flows. And I know this graphic has a lot of small text, so don't worry about it too much for now. I'll walk us through the main points in it. So in 2009, the province began a 6-year Water Act modernization process, and this included many different opportunities for public input, which I'm sure several of you on the line today were part of. This process ended in May 2014 when the legislature passed the new Water Sustainability Act. The Act passed in 2014, and then in February of last year, the province released a new budget, and that included $25 million over 3 years to implement the new Act. Also in February 2015, the province released a new water pricing schedule that will come into effect in 2016. And this roughly doubles the price that water license holders will pay for water. So throughout 2014 and 2015, the province was busy developing priority regulations, and this is kind of the first round of regulations that will bring the Act into force. This includes the regulations for groundwater licensing, groundwater protection, dam safety, as well as updates to tickets and fines. So the target date to bring the new Act into force, at which point the Water Act will be repealed, is early 2016, so any day now. And then onwards into 2016, 2017, and beyond, the province is going to continue to work on what we're calling Phase 2 regulations. So those include the regulations for things like water objectives as well as planning and governance. So before we go much further, I just want to have a quick aside here to clarify what regulations are and why they are so important. So the Water Sustainability Act is what's called a framework or an enabling act, which means that many of the details of this legislation will be found in separate supporting regulations. So regulations are subordinate legislation authorized under an enabling act, and they set out the details of how a law will be interpreted and applied. So that's a lot of legal jargon, but what makes sense to me is a metaphor that the Water Sustainability Act is like the canoe and the regulations are like the paddles. So we really need a sturdy set of paddles to propel this canoe forward. Before I pass things over to Oliver for the legislative history piece, I'm just going to give a very quick overview of the groundwater regulation. And of course, there's lots to say about groundwater, and it is one of the most important pieces of the Water Sustainability Act. But I'm going to keep this brief for today. And if you'd like more background on the groundwater piece, there's a major chapter of the Awash report that discusses this. So as I mentioned, groundwater licensing is one of the first priority regulations that the province has been developing that will bring the Act into force. Until now, all groundwater extractions in BC have been unlicensed and free. So this is changing. When the Act does come into force, all non-domestic groundwater users, that's all non-household users, will now be required to hold a license and pay fees and rentals for the first time. Domestic users, so your household wells, are generally going to be exempt from regulation, but in key areas experiencing scarcity or conflict, domestic groundwater use could be regulated through a few different ways. So on that note, I'm going to pass it over to Oliver for the legislative history piece.
Good day, everybody. I hope everyone can hear me. I think I'm unmuted. So let me just launch right in. First off, thanking Megan for doing such a good job of getting us all set up here, and everybody for giving some of their time, and to Rosie, who set up this conversation very nicely. I believe it's always critical to understand very well where we're headed. It's sometimes important to know where we've come from, and that's a bit of what I'm going to sort of set the scene with, and I'm also hoping to engage in a bit of a discussion about the broader structures of this act and fundamentally or at that principle level what will change. We'll dive back into the weeds with some further detail towards the end as I pass it back to Rosie to walk through a few more of the specific regulation areas that we're potentially excited about. So of course, and many of you have seen this image, I use this often, this kind of captures the sense of where we as British Columbians came from and really the context for the original act, the original Water Act as it was, because British Columbia was really, as it was being settled, of course First Nations were there before that, but as the settlers came, it really became a place where there was a lot of emphasis on mining, resource extraction. First Nations were often either ignored or were not in a critical part of that. It was a very resource-based economy. And that was really the context of where BC was and what some of the initial thinking around the Act was. And you can see that in some of this early legislative history. The gold rush being one of these critical drivers where the Act was set up to basically help give some certainty and to diminish some of the conflict that was happening in the 50s and through to the early 1900s. 1909, the first Act comes into force. That sets the framework, and I'm going to argue many of the principles that largely still play today, and I think part of the discussion that we're trying to have about how we really advance. Some early modifications through the 30s as the process got set up, and then there was a sort of significant set of changes in the 60s, where they moved much more to a discretionary decision-making focus. It sort of, in a sense, becomes a more modern piece of legislation in the sense that we understand it today. The comptroller has an important role in those decisions, taking advice from the regional engineers, and this regionalized model over time begins to develop. More recently, we see a few changes that have happened that are very important. First off, in the 90s, we see an effort to update the Act, and some of these early initiatives, at the time called the Sustaining the Water Resources Initiative, brought a lot of the very same ideas that we're grappling with today forward at that time. So it was very far-sighted. However, a number of issues, such as a real emphasis on groundwater regulation for domestic users, created a fair bit of opposition. as well as forestry issues of the time. As many of you may be familiar, Clayoquot Sound and other events, one of the largest civil disobedience, largest mass arrests, brought the spotlight of attention much more on forestry and sort of set in motion a period of forestry reform. Let's fast forward to 96 when an important piece of legislation does get passed, what's called the Water Protection Act. It does a few things. It affirms ownership that is vested in the Crown of all water, including groundwater. It prohibits bulk water removal from British Columbia, and that was an important driver that was very much on people's mind as a big concern, was this idea of bulk water exports. And it prohibited large-scale water transfers from major watersheds within the province. So we begin to see the early inklings of this ecological approach as water sort of raises in importance. More recently, we see the Fish Protection Act, which has obviously, as the title suggests, an emphasis on the fish aspects, a number of pieces, including the sensitive stream designations, and some of the riparian, what ultimately became the riparian areas regulations are in essence created. Many of these early efforts to basically start dealing with what is now becoming clear as a changing climate, more droughts, more scarcity, more limits, are exerted through this new piece of legislation. Well, groundwater was, of course, an important piece, and as far back as that 1960s early reforms, it was empowered, but just never came into force. More recently, in 2004, we see the well drillers and well construction itself was regulated. So how you drilled it and how you capped it was regulated, but not how much you could withdraw. And it isn't, as Rosie's already suggested, until the 2014 Act, which, when it comes into force, that we'll see groundwater quantity being regulated. So just to summarize, what we have is this Water Act and these colonial water law foundations. Number one, it's over 100 years old. We know that its primary purpose was to facilitate gold mining and agricultural development, and I will argue that it really served its purpose of the day. It did a very good job of that. It created a century worth of some certainty. It created lots of the early opportunities for economic development. It certainly, in my view, was not an environmental law, but really a set of resource extraction rules. One of the very critical defects is it largely ignored First Nations rights and title and asserts this Crown ownership, where even in British Columbia, where many regions have unceded title, remains very contentious. What we can see exhibited is really what I'm going to call the principles of Western water law that you can see throughout North America in the West, Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba in Canada, but also in the west of the U.S. And these are these characteristics. One is FITFR, which we know is first in time, first in right. And it creates a date-based system from when the water license is allocated. The oldest user gets to use the full amount, and the junior licenses, when there are limits, are cut off. So it creates a date-based, hence first in time, first in right, first come, first served system. There was also a strong economic link to beneficial use. So the license was issued with the understanding that it would be put to beneficial use, and that beneficial use has historically not been very clearly or has been not at all defined. And this economic link increasingly is the sense or is the link to what beneficial use is. And in British Columbia has largely come to represent if you pay your fees for holding your license, that is a big part of how you're demonstrating your beneficial use. Use it or lose it, of course, is sort of an implied principle that underlies this, because if you're not using it, you had the danger of losing your license, and that sometimes created an incentive for not always the most efficient or conservative approach to the water itself. The management enforcement came through administrative action, and it was really based on a discretionary statutory decision-making model. So these are the characteristics. These are common throughout Western water law. Many of these elements still exist, but some are changing. So that's where we changed the channel from the History Channel to the current news, and what will the Water Sustainability Act give us? And these are sort of the 7 points that we reveal or daylight in this research in our Awash report. Number one, we see the extending to groundwater. And of course, this is long overdue and widely supported and an important development. It begins to treat the water cycle as a whole cycle, which is very critical. Of course, surface water is important, but groundwater, as we know, is interlinked with surface water in many places. FIFR remains an overarching or foundational principle, this first-in-time, first-in-right system, but there are now different and more opportunities, what I call off-ramps, to work around some of the challenges that come with a FIFR-based system. And we'll discuss those in a little more detail, but one of the important FIFR off-ramps relates to the legal protections associated with the environmental flow needs. So for the first time, we see in the actual legislation places where the environment, nature as a user or water for nature, being elevated in importance, where, and again we'll discuss a little more as I go through some of the environmental flow protections, where the environmental flow, critical flows or fish protection flows can in essence move ahead of the queue of the date. So other users, human users, can have their use suspended when water for nature or water for fish are being challenged. Of course, any sophisticated modern regime requires monitoring and reporting. You need to know how much is being used to manage it effectively. And of course, these elements are now enabled in the Act, which will be very important to creating a sophisticated regime over time. Rosie will delve into a little more detail towards the end of the presentation about these water objectives. But from a summary perspective, what the water objectives do, and again, in the big picture sense, they begin to link the water to its broader watershed or land-based system. It's an important conduit where we link land and water use. This is an important part of the evolution of the Act that has changed from the historical, very narrow, siloed, very singular approach to something that becomes more integrated and begins to make the connections of activities on the land affecting our water. And really one of the key elements enabled through the planning and governance, but it creates a foundation for much more of a partnership model. And certainly when we look globally, and that's some of the work we do, is we look at the various evolutions of water law and governance, watershed governance all around the world. And in places where those challenges or those crises manifest, for example, South Africa, Australia, the Western United States, Brazil, we see a very common model, and that is increased collaboration, much more emphasis on a partnership approach, understanding that a variety of players have a role to play. And finally, this idea of beneficial use will have much more clarity. We already know that there will be clear efficiency requirements, and we suspect the regulations will further define what exactly beneficial use is, which will create an important incentive to both increase efficiency, so more bang for your buck or for your drop, but also to begin driving the innovation and the conservation that's so urgently needed when you face limited sources. So this gives you sort of an overview of what the key new elements are. So there's some aspects that haven't changed. Of course, this is a very big act, and much or many elements remain fundamentally similar. Still emphasis on allocating and licensing. Some of the concerns or criticisms that are still being articulated and that we identify is this colonial structure. Number one, that the FIFR system remains and that it is extended to groundwater. We believe there are some vulnerabilities, but also these off-ramps offer some chances to move around that. So we will see how this evolves over time. Also that the Crown asserts ownership, which of course is very contentious for many First Nation and Aboriginal peoples, and this arguably continues the exclusion of the Indigenous water rights. And that will be a major challenge moving forward and part of the ongoing reconciliation that will inevitably be needed. And the system still relies on a discretionary decision-making model by statutory decision makers, which can both be a strength and a weakness in any sort of legislative regime. The strength is it allows a lot of discretion, a lot of context, but it requires a good foundation of knowledge, data, information. The decision maker really needs to be equipped to make the right decisions, and the community or the watershed groups or First Nations or those impacted need to ensure that they have an opportunity to trigger or have the ability to review those decisions so that they build confidence and not conflict. So this is an important slide, and we use the metaphor of the river here to talk about this new partnership model. And I'm just going to spend about 3 or 4 minutes trying to explain how this partnership model will change the way water is managed and what the ultimate end goals are. Number one, the approach emphasizes that there's a shared risk and responsibility, that there's much more emphasis on local solutions, that there are long-term water planning and decision-making is a foundation. So sharing that decision-making is a key to that partnership. Of course, First Nations will play a critical role, starting with sharing of a government-to-government decision-making with the province. That's going to be an important element as articulated in the Constitution, Section 35 rights, but also going forward as a partner. In addition, co-leading and engaging with local watershed organizations in the planning processes and those local decisions, informed by local knowledge and some of the Indigenous laws that currently exist. This collaboration will be critical, and it really engages complete regime without full engagement by First Nations across the province, both in setting the terms of how the engagement will happen, but in the specifics of how those regional plans, thresholds, decisions will be made. And of course, the province, with support of the federal government, will be a critical actor. We know that they will have to be sharing and co-creating some of these processes, both with First Nations and with some of the communities that are impacted. Setting the rules and enforcing those rules are going to be critical, because the law will only have real impact if actions have consequences. So setting thresholds, ensuring that information is gathered, that water rentals are collected properly and sufficient to support the knowledge, information, and planning processes, that there are regular state of our water reporting so that we understand how the system's health is changing over time and where the real needs are. Of course, providing science, data, and analysis, and of course, leading that water stewardship by leading by example. License holders are a critical part of this mix. They will be monitoring and reporting their water use, in many cases for the first time. They will be emphasizing that they are using the water beneficially and as efficiently as possible, engaging proactively in the planning and water governance, paying the fees, which is critical to a sophisticated regime, and of course complying with the various regulations and thresholds, but really being an active participant in the planning, proactive part of the water governance regime. And of course, the sort of fourth category of actors that we identify is the communities, the watershed entities, and local governments. These are the places where many of the actual solutions will be created, where the real on-the-ground work will be done, the promoting of wise water use, the contributing to all the knowledge that's going to be needed, the local expertise, the knowledge for the state of the water reporting, and actively undertaking water stewardship and encouraging conservation. This will all work collectively together to create this, what we were saying is a 21st century management and governance regime, but ultimately for it to have a real emphasis towards this approach, which is water for nature as an important component with sustainable outcomes, means new patterns of water use. That is ultimately, and that we believe is fully enabled in this new act, subject to, of course, a number of things. We're going to start with the simple and obvious need for license fees and rentals to be set high enough to fully fund all this implementation. There's a great deal enabled in what I'm going to argue is a framework legislation. Many of the regulations are still to be articulated or created. There's going to be a lot of work that needs to happen. This will cost money. It will need resources on the ground. Rosie identified the $25 million budget lift, which is an important first step and gets us moving. In addition, we need to be regularly reviewing these pricing schemes to ensure that we're having sufficient resources to get the work done. So with that, I think this is the place where I hand over my part. Oh no, actually I get to do environmental flows. Sorry, Rosie, if you were getting nervous there. So the 5 key regulation areas that we identify are environmental flows, groundwater, monitoring and reporting, water objectives, planning and governance. Really, our argument is simple, that these 5 elements, they're not the only elements. We identify well over 60 areas where regulations and other developments are likely needed over time, but these 5 will be really critical to put the sustainable in the Sustainability Act. I'm going to fairly quickly go through the environmental flows piece, but as Rosie mentioned, groundwater is one of the critical elements, and I would argue environmental flows is one of the other really critical elements. This whole new regime, at the end of the day, needs to achieve something. We're going to get regulation of groundwater for the first time. We're going to have opportunities for a much more robust partnership model, and we're going to see a role for water for nature that really will fundamentally change, and it's built around this notion of environmental flows. What I have in front of you, and many of you may have seen this before because our last webinar with Brian Richter and Deb Curran had a real focus around environmental flows. I've listed some of their slides just to help our introduction here. But environmental flows, as per the Brisbane Declaration, is the quantity, timing, quality of water flows required to sustain freshwater and estuary ecosystems and the human livelihoods and well-being that depend on these ecosystems. Basically, it's what makes a river, and it's more than just water. I think that's the trick. And what do I mean by that? It's both a timing component, so it's a pulse that exists in a river, but it has other elements. Water quality, connectivity, the species interaction collectively is about that ecological health, those ecosystem services. And ecologists increasingly recognize that the flow regime is really the master variable. And that's really the critical interface with the Act, which emphasizes, or one of the key pieces, is the idea of water quantity and the licensing that goes with it. So the environmental flow piece really is at its center. Now, on my screen here, this graph looks, or this image looks a little haywire, so pardon me if that's the case for you as well. But this is really what we're trying to go after. It's moving the allocation system to a 21st century approach. In the top, circles, which you probably can't see very well, we see over time, as human use increases, the pie gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So basically, the water available for the environment as a second or as an afterthought diminishes. Whereas a 21st century approach really takes much more overt emphasis in saying that the environment is a critical user. In fact, it's a foundational user. Without it, the economy, our community health, our industries would not be able to function. So we really need to ensure that we have this sustainability boundary, and then we can allocate human uses for the various uses, such as economic, agriculture, manufacturing, et cetera, over time. That's really the purpose. And that's the role of environmental flows, to help define that. So what we had in the old Act was limited protections through regional policies with a real fish protection emphasis. What's new, and I think from certainly when one looks internationally, a big step forward, is that we see a much more formal integration of this environmental flow consideration into the regime. First point is that decision makers must consider environmental flows when issuing new licenses. So they must actively cast their mind to exactly those images that I had up before about how much water does a river need before they're allocating more water for the future. This will be an important part of the consideration. In addition, we see the provisions for critical environmental flow and fish population protection orders, which allows a kind of a safety net. So when we have droughts or those difficult periods, shortages, short-term periods of limited water, we have an ability to ensure that those fish populations and those critical environmental flows are maintained. So we have an ability to basically limit human uses during those very vulnerable periods. The way I like to think about it, and that we're increasingly thinking about it, is not so much as is there one or two sections or a single regulation, but that there is in fact a web of protections that exist under the Water Sustainability Act. We've listed sort of about a dozen here of some of the mechanisms, and we call the first sort of cohort the primary mechanisms. This sort of Section 15, the must consider. So when new licenses are issued, the statutory decision maker must consider, and we see a number of these protections and mitigation measures that are possible. In addition, and Rosie will discuss in a little more detail, some of the planning and in particular the water objectives, which are potentially powerful tools. The water objectives element is very critical in this web or net approach because it is part of the mechanism, the legal mechanism, to enable us to connect the land and water uses. Planning, of course, water sustainability plans, which will be effort and labor intensive, but will be potentially very powerful for beginning to integrate and create those firm legal protections for water sustainability plans. So finally, I just want to emphasize that what we have is the potential for a very robust regime, still contingent on a few of the regulations and the actual plans to happen. However, there are a few concerns, one of which is the limited opportunities to address impacts of existing licenses on environmental flows. We're very fortunate in BC that as a whole province, we do not have major water issues, but we have an increasing number of regional concerns. So as long as we get ahead of the curve, we will be in a place where we can address some of these challenges. We did some comparative work with California, and you see a whole different world there where they are in a much more serious or precarious situation. So we would argue that you need a sophisticated regime, as discussed before in the web analogy, but that some elements need to be actually codified in the regulation. So not just relying on a policy that can influence what the decision maker makes, but a regulation that's very transparent and very clear. We also need to ensure that we're protecting more than just water quantity, because again, I draw your attention back to the opening slide on this environmental flow section, where we talk about the various elements that make up an environmental flow, and that's that broader, again, what makes a river, the broader than just the quantity of water, but timing, the quality, the connectivity, the healthy habitat, all these elements, and that is going to be very critical. And really what we argue is, from a quantity perspective, you need to start with a presumptive standard. We are probably not, we're going to have over, we have many thousands of rivers and streams throughout the province. We're not going to have the individual environmental flows on each and every one. Some of the more important ones, we will have important detail. But what we need to do is ensure that we have a presumptive standard that applies everywhere and that the decision makers are very clearly aware of as they make future decisions. Over time, of course, as different regional analysis, data, information, assessments are done, those can be refined, but we need that presumptive standard to start with. At this point, I think I'm now ready to hand it over to Rosie.
Yes, I am back online here. So I'm going to again take over from Oliver again to talk about the 3 remaining core regulation areas that we identify in this report. And again, those are monitoring and reporting, water objectives, and planning and governance. And again, all of these are phase 2 regulations, so they're still a ways out. And this is really just our best understanding of how we think these regulation areas will and should work. So starting then with monitoring and reporting, this is really about having data on how water license holders are actually using the water they're authorized to. So there's currently many different gaps in BC's data on fresh water, and that includes a lack of information on how much water is actually currently being diverted. So right now, in general, license holders are not required to report how much water they're actually using. So the province knows how much they're licensed or authorized to use, but not the actual kind of real-world use levels. It's worth noting that there actually has been some progress with this with the Oil and Gas Commission in northeastern BC, which does now require mandatory water use reporting on withdrawals. So the Water Sustainability Act does introduce a host of kind of new opportunities for monitoring and reporting requirements, and I've just listed a couple on the slide here. So for instance, license applicants may be required to undertake studies and provide data to decision makers when they're assessing the impacts of that proposed license on environmental flow needs. Further, water users that affect sensitive or streams that are designated as sensitive may be required to measure and report water conditions as a requirement of their license. Cabinet also has the ability to pass regulations on measuring, testing, and reporting. And as Oliver mentioned in the discussion about the new partnership approach, we're really suggesting that what's needed here is a more substantial role for water license holders in monitoring and reporting. So we're suggesting that this includes providing baseline data with the license application, as well as regular and reporting that information to the province so that we have an accurate picture of how much water is actually being taken. So the next regulation area here is water objectives. And as Oliver mentioned, this is a really core area of the Water Sustainability Act with a lot of potential. So as you all know, land use activities in BC have an array of cumulative impacts on fresh water. But really until now, there hasn't been a coordinated way for the different land and resource use decision makers to consider impacts on water when they're making their individual decisions on the Crown landscape. So the Water Sustainability Act creates this new authority to set water objectives and regulation for the purposes of sustaining water quality, water quantity, and aquatic ecosystems. And the idea is that these water objectives set criteria for water quality and quantity that these different land and resource use decision makers must consider when they're making their decisions. So objectives could be set for things like turbidity, environmental flow levels, water temperature, etc. And these regulations that create water objectives can specify a number of different things, and that includes which decision makers are required to consider objectives and what that decision maker must do to address the potential impact of a proposal on an objective. The regulations can also require local governments, regional districts, local trust committees, municipalities, and other entities to consider water objectives in their planning processes. And water objectives are potentially quite powerful because these regulations that establish them may provide that they override or apply despite other objectives, standards, or other enactments. In terms of what's needed here, we did a fairly substantial review of both water objectives in other areas and objectives used in other forms of environmental management. And sort of three key lessons emerged from that. And that is that to be effective, objectives need to be both specific and measurable. They need to be actually required for consideration by all relevant decision makers. And they need to actually be linked to ecological function within specific ecosystems. So these objectives actually have to be set so that they're relevant to the ecosystem in which they are applied. And last but not least here is the area of planning and governance. And this is going to be a very brief overview of what is a very detailed section of the Water Sustainability Act. So currently in BC, we have a variety of different water planning processes and water-based plans, but few of these plans are enforceable. And even though the province does have many different tools to create legislative plans, few have actually been used. And the new Water Sustainability Act introduces a very comprehensive new planning regime known as water sustainability plans. And these plans can be developed for areas experiencing some form of conflict. So that could be conflict between different water users, conflict between water users and environmental flows, risk to water quality and ecosystem health, etc. These plans must be designated by the minister, but they can be requested by a third party. And what's really interesting about these plans is that they can address an array of issues, so not just water quality or quantity. They can really be tailor-made to address specific regional problems. These plans can be made binding through plan-specific regulations. And again, those regulations can do many different things, including a requirement to reduce existing water diversions. As Oliver mentioned, these plans will be very time and resource intensive to develop. In terms of what's needed, it's great that these provisions are in the Water Sustainability Act. Now, the really key thing is going to be to develop these plans and also to follow through on implementation, and doing this in partnership with First Nations. And this will require committing adequate resources for plan development and the follow-through in implementation. Section 126 of the new Act introduces the possibility of actually delegating decision-making under the Act to other organizations or entities. And that includes things like the power to issue licenses and enforce the Act. So what this means is that there's now the possibility for more opportunities for local decision-making. In terms of what's needed here, there needs to be a clear articulation of the rules for how this delegated governance could work, and also a need to begin piloting some possible shared decision-making models to test different approaches, as this is a very new piece for British Columbia. that was a lot of detail that we just dove into, kind of the nitty-gritties of the new act. So I just want to end so you can get us out of the weeds and think bigger picture again. Overall, as we've highlighted here, the Water Sustainability Act really does take BC much further than the Water Act did in terms of better managing and protecting fresh water. There still are outstanding concerns and much more work to be done in the regulation development phases. And ultimately, BC can go much further, and certainly some other areas in the world show some valuable insights into sort of the realm of possibilities within water law. I'm just going to quickly highlight the three on the slide here. So in New Zealand, the Wanganui River Settlement Agreement actually granted a river legal personhood and involves a really innovative shared decision-making and governance structure between the Maori and the New Zealand state, sort of showing the possibilities for co-governance and shared decision-making with First Nations. In the United States, the Winters Doctrine better acknowledges and protects tribal water rights by actually granting them priority from the date at which reservations were formed, so different from the way in which FIT-FIR has been applied in British Columbia. And various parts of the states have really embraced in law the public trust doctrine, which holds that water is not owned, but it's rather held in trust for citizens and future generations. So these three examples and many more show that the Water Sustainability Act is really just the first step on a much longer path. And we'll wrap up with that, and looking forward to the discussion with all of you today.
So let me
Thanks,
just
Rosie and Oliver. Oliver, I'll let you go. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize, number one, that just putting this whole thing in context, this is a monumental effort to bring this new regime into place, and that we should acknowledge the hard work of the many staff at the ministries who've worked very hard over a long period to bring us here, that there's much positive to offer, and that this is a real opportunity for British Columbians if they fully embrace this partnership approach to a whole new approach to how we deal with water in the province. So I want to emphasize that as an important part of the context as we engage in hopefully a thoughtful conversation going forward.
Great, thanks, Oliver. So I think now we'll move into our discussion period. So if you have a question for Oliver or Rosie, you can type it into the chat box and we'll take them in order. While we get some questions coming in, I'll just pull up a little resource pod here. A report, Awash with Opportunities, so you can download the report as well as the executive summary for free on our website. Then I've also included links to a couple of our recent media articles we've had published related to the report. So the first is an op-ed that we had published in December in the Vancouver Sun, as well as an article in Water Canada for their January-February issue. So I think we'll start looking at questions now.
Megan,
so
before you do that, I just want to jump in with a few other sort of just quick notes. Rosie did a fabulous job of sort of wrapping up our conversation, and each of those sort of what I'm going to call the cutting edge or the next level pieces, you know, the future, have been, many of them we've covered in previous webinars. So if you're interested in those, we can point to lots of resources. It's been an active part of the conversation that we at POLIS have been having and hosting over the years. The other piece, and I really want to emphasize, is you know, we've spent a lot of time, the whole research team spent a lot of time analyzing the Act itself. But we are not experts in the Act, and many elements are still to be determined. And we'll do our best, I think, as we can over the next 30 minutes or so, answering specific questions people will have about how the Act works or who it applies to. But just recognize that, again, this wasn't our Act. We didn't write the Act. We're just analyzing. We've participated as best we could to support the developments, but much of it at this point is still a little bit speculative and uncertain. And so I'll resist anyone out there who knows. I love to speculate, but I'm going to resist the urge to speculate too much. And I'll answer what I can, but we likely won't have as much specific detail as many of the people out there would like. But what we will commit to doing is hopefully hosting a session, and maybe once the new regs are in place and it's fully into force, seeing if we can get some of our government colleagues to come and help us understand the very specific details that I know everybody's going to be very interested in.
Great, thanks, Oliver. It's important clarification. Are you ready to start with questions now? We've got a whole suite lined up.
Great.
Sounds good. Okay, so our first one is from Jill Thompson, and she's asking, how do objectives get set? Is that provincial or in local water sustainability plans, or in both?
So the provision is in Section 43, which allows the creation of an objective, and that basically will be passed, as far as I understand it, as an order in council, which will be like a regulation. So it'll be a very specific thing, likely applied to a place, and as Rosie sort of outlined in her piece, will relate to a specific location, so I'd call it place-based. It will specify in what way and who will need to either consider it or apply it. In general, one of the powers of that is that it's going to affect decision makers outside of the water realm. So of course it'll affect future licensing decisions and all, and plans and all that. But it will also affect, for example, people making forestry decisions or mining decisions if there are very specific either quality or quantity thresholds or provisions. They'll have to cast their mind to that. So it begins that connection from the water to the landscape. It will also affect local governments. So as they do their zoning or local plans, those objectives will also have application. And finally, my sense is, and again, lots of the details of the process of how the water sustainability plans will be developed still remain to be defined, but these objectives, if they're applicable, will of course be folded in to these plans, so they'll have to be consistent with each other.
Great, thanks, Oliver. So our next question is from Martin Carver, asking, do we know yet whether FRPA will override direction coming out of the new Water Sustainability Act? So I'm not too sure what the acronym is, FRPA.
I think it's Forest and Range Practices Act, I think.
Okay.
I'll take it.
I don't think we can say. I'm sure there are some ministry folk on the line that maybe will know, but my suspicion is no, because certainly in the objectives and in the plans, it's very clear that that's meant to apply. So there aren't clear exceptions at this point, as far as I know. Again, it's a 150-page act, so I'd have to look again in detail. But those plans and objectives that are created would apply to other legislation and other statutory decision makers.
Great, thanks, Oliver. So our next one, a bit more of a general question from Atul Deshmukh, asking what are some of the similarities and dissimilarities between the Federal Act and the BC Water Sustainability Act?
Well, fundamentally quite different, because different jurisdictions. The Federal Water Act is much more of a mechanism for collaboration. Basically, it's the conduit legally where the federal government can participate in supporting planning, etc. This, now we're talking into the realm of constitutional law. The Water Sustainability Act is clearly within the head of provincial powers to the head of powers around public lands, and basically to manage public lands, in this case being water, sort of provide the licenses. So they're quite different. It's a lengthy sort of constitutional discussion, but the federal government's role in water allocations is very limited, with perhaps the exception, obviously, on federal lands, such as in parks, as part of treaties, or on reserves. But even there, in most cases, the provincial system is just applied.
Great, thanks. So we have another question here from Reed Early. It's specifically for Oliver. So Reed is asking, are city water systems addressed by the Water Sustainability Act as any other user? So i.e. any different standards expected of municipal license holders versus non-municipal?
My understanding is that, again, it would be basically the detail in the license itself, but a municipal license holder would be treated the same as any of the other categories. They would pay their fees. They'd have to abide by the various provisions in the license, but there may be some specific unique to municipalities or unique to drinking water types of provisions in their license themselves. I think that answers the question, but I think the main point is that municipalities, regional districts, other water purveyors and providers, in essence, have to get a license to provide water for their various users, citizens, etc. And in that sense, they are treated the same as other license holders.
Great, thanks, Oliver. A question from Sonia Jensen saying, thanks for the presentation and for all your work in this area. And she's wondering if we're able to speak about Section 40 of the Water Sustainability Act that outlines the protocol of a water reservation and First Nations. So she's asking, what is a water reservation, and is this section of the Act the start of a new partnership and consideration for customary rights?
The page flipping you're hearing is me looking at the Act.
Very specific questions today.
Rosie, I'm not sure if you have that on the top of your head.
Not on the top of my head. I'm just looking it up as well.
So I think the short answer is I don't think this is an overt part of the intention. I think it probably relates mostly to it's sort of the legal mechanism by which treaties can create these reservations as part of the treaties. But I'm going to stop my speculating there because I don't know. I have to get back to you on that.
Sure, sounds good. Okay, we'll move on to another question. Another one from Atul Bishmukh, asking, how does the Act work when rivers or other streams flow from another province into BC? So I guess getting at the border issue. How does it work around borders?
Good question. I mean, in simple terms, it works the same. Obviously, it gets more challenging, the range of considerations that need to be done, and if there's any sort of plans when you get into cross-boundary. I mean, a great example for British Columbia is the Mackenzie, which is, of course, a very large basin system in the north. A number of partners, Alberta, Northwest Territories, Yukon, Saskatchewan. So that creates its own sort of separate planning process, and they have a Mackenzie Master Agreement, very sophisticated. And in fact, we have a webinar. I don't know if, Megan, you're able to put that up, but we have a webinar on that. But the rules, in a sense, the provincial rules, the BC provincial rules will apply to the BC portion of those shared waters. Similarly, the Columbia, which is an international transboundary water, the same sort of allocation rules will apply in the Columbia portion. Of course, there's another overlay, so thinking like a layered approach, the Columbia River Treaty sets out some very specific requirements, rules, and processes for how the two parties interact. And in fact, we intend to, in the next year's installments, to do a very focused session on the Columbia River Treaty and what it sort of means more broadly for transboundary water and watershed governance.
Thanks, Oliver. And Atul, I can send you the link to our Mackenzie Basin webinar if you are interested in exploring that issue a bit further. Move on to a question from David Stapley asking, will water objectives be applied to owners of private forest lands?
Water objectives will affect statutory decision makers. So if there are statutory decision makers making decisions on private lands, and there are some limited ones, but again, I don't know. I'm not an expert on private managed lands, but I suspect that there will be some interface there, yes.
Thanks, Oliver. Question from Andrea Fallet. First Nations are concerned with many development projects across the province. How will their concerns be integrated into the decision-making process? And can First Nations stop a project, or is the provincial, federal government, or does the provincial or federal government have the final say? So sort of a contentious issue she's touching on.
Yeah, I think that's one that's a little bit outside of it'd be highly speculative. You know, of course, there's the usual role for Section 35, exertion of rights and title, and there are court cases, and so the field of Aboriginal law is evolving very quickly in a very sophisticated way. The recent Chilcotin decision certainly points in that direction. Again, I think from the perspective of our research here, we're trying to emphasize that more valuable might be going in the direction of more of a partnership approach, and that clearly there are some opportunities to do that in a better way, especially when we're talking about the sort of regional or local-based water sustainability plans, and that really will be or require the co-leadership, government to government on one level, but also that shared or delegated decision-making and planning processes to allow that to happen.
Thanks, Oliver. I'll move on to a question from Darwin Horning, kind of getting at the budget to implement the Water Sustainability Act, asking, is there a breakdown of the $25 million and where it is being applied? As we know, resourcing some of these initiatives, like the sustainable watershed planning, will be difficult if not properly resourced.
I couldn't agree more. I suspect there are some breakdowns. I don't have access to them. I think that's something that ministry people, those are sort of operational questions. I think a large portion of the investment will be in increasing some of the science capacity, the stewardship officers on the ground, the operational staff, but I don't have a sense yet how the intended allocation of the budget. Just to be clear, that budget lift is $25 million over 3 years from the last budget cycle. So it's you know, I think those sort of specifics of the budgets are still emerging.
Thanks, Oliver. Just looking through the chat box now, I've had a few comments. Rick Simpson saying that so we can expect to see on-the-ground real-world results and local consultation leading to action. Yes, I hope so. See if we've got another question here. So from Emma Louie, saying great informative presentation, thanking you both, and asking a question about the precautionary principle and how do you think we can incorporate public trust principles or ensure that water is upheld as a human right in the Act?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if Emma is aware. We have done a fair bit of work on the public trust doctrine itself. And again, Megan, you might pull up the briefing note, and we also had a number of webinars. The most obvious place that something like that could have gone is in the Section 2, or sort of the key Crown ownership sections. That is not in there, so that was a choice not made. However, I think some of the principles or sort of facets of the public trust doctrine could exist in the definition of beneficial use, which will be largely done by regulation. So I think that's still an open part of the conversation. Just to be clear to everybody, you know, our view of the public trust doctrine is that it's a sort of legal principle that exists around much of the world. Many jurisdictions pursue it, and it says that there are a handful of resources, water being one of them, that are so critical that, in essence, government or the manager only holds it in trust for others. And it, you know, in a legal terms, it's a background principle of property law, meaning that the property, in this case water, is not entirely open to do anything you want, even for the Crown, that there's some limits to what they can and can't do. In essence, they cannot either give it away or over-allocate it, because that will too greatly impact you know, future generations, citizens, the community at large. And the way it sort of manifested itself, it's sort of an ancient concept that's manifested itself in law in a variety of ways. There are two sort of primary ways. One is you actually codify it in the legislation itself, in the statute, and you basically say water is a public trust, thereby putting limits on what statutory decision makers can or can't decide. And that, you know, there are some examples of that, certainly in the Northwest Territories around wildlife acts and others. and in other jurisdictions, U.S. uses it as an important tool. U.S. states, Western states, there are many. It can also exist, which it currently does, as a background principle in common law. And common law is where the judge-made rules happen, and they can read it in, and there's certain, I guess, clues that that would be possible as well. Relatively famous case called Canfor from the early 2000s around forestry, suggesting that certain kinds of resources, like in this case it was forestry or lumber, is part of a broader public interest, and we need to take this sort of public trust notion into account when we're making some of these decisions. So I would argue that in two fronts we will see some potential. One will be as the common law continues to evolve, I think we'll see more examples of the public trust, especially in the context of water. Relatively new territory, very few actual court cases around conflict or issues in water. They're just sort of emerging, not surprisingly, only when you sort of face scarcity and increasing conflict. On the other side, I could see some statutory developments over time. I know that a number of other provinces and territories are also going through law reform processes, and they will likely at least grapple with some of these concepts. And what happens in law reform is as one jurisdiction makes changes, others often follow that path. So you see a very iterative approach. So it's a very long-winded answer to say, yes, there's potential. No, it's not in there right now. It could be in some modest way through beneficial use, but I would argue in the next 5 to 10 years, this will become an ever increasingly active part of the conversation.
Thanks, Oliver. And looks like we're having some folks logging off, and I think we will make a question from Kirsty Rendell, our last question. So we've still got a few more to go. First, we'll go to one from Atul Deshmukh, another borders question. So just acknowledging that BC rivers run down into the U.S., and does this Water Sustainability Act impact international river regulations between the two countries?
I must admit I don't really know what we're talking about here. The provisions of the Act, like international law, BC is a sovereign jurisdiction and can pass its laws. If it were to be somehow inconsistent with agreements in a international treaty, there would be problems and there would be some dispute mechanisms for that. My sense is nothing here would do that. So I'm not quite sure if we're getting into a conflict of laws kind of discussion or if he has a specific scenario or regulation in mind.
Sure, and Atul, if you want to clarify, you can just type into the chat box. I think for now we'll move on to another question from Robin Ford, who's saying you suggest that fees, etc., should be sufficient to cover all costs, but isn't there an argument that some costs should come out of general revenue?
I've spoken.
I think in part based on the user pays principle, at least there has to be some sufficient revenue coming from the license fees and rentals to ensure, just in making sure those rates are set high enough to fund implementation. I'm not sure, Oliver, if you want to speak about the general revenue aspect of that question.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add.
Okay, we'll move on to a question from Andrea Follet. How will existing water licenses be impacted by the Water Sustainability Act, and will these new rules apply? It's an important question.
It is. It's a big question. I'd say, of course, the new rules apply in some senses. So a classic bit of weasel. The critical flows and some of the fish protection order potentials will apply, and some of them already existed in the Fish Protection Act, and they are just sort of rolled into the new act. So most certainly in there. Many of the conditions, and I guess that was one of the criticisms we had, is the Section 15 part where the decision maker has to think about environmental flows going forward. He thought, or we're talking about new decisions going forward. So that of course won't affect old licenses. There are some mitigation type requirements. Well, the planning provisions could affect old licenses, and it's fairly sophisticated what's involved in that. We'll probably do a webinar sometime next year specifically about the water sustainability plans once a little more is revealed, but there are a number of elements in there that include the ability to impact existing licenses, the quantity or the volumes allocated in existing licenses, but it probably triggers some kind of compensation. So if you take away some elements or some part of an existing license, you may have to compensate specific to a water sustainability plan. But other aspects that will affect going forward is this ability now, once the Act is in force, after 30 years, the various components or elements of those licenses could potentially be adjusted, updated, revised. So that means there's now what were in essence licenses handed out in perpetuity may now be revisited in a 30-year kind of time cycle.
Thanks, Oliver. And another question here on water sustainability plans from Teresa Fresco, saying that there are many tools to initiate some kind of planning within watersheds. And do you have any ideas as to how the water sustainability plans will incorporate or speak to these other tools under different acts?
Rosie, you want to start out?
Sure, yeah. So in the section of the Act that looks at how the water sustainability plans can be developed, there is a section that says that in the development of these plans, they may consider other existing planning processes within or adjacent to that area. So that could include First Nations plans, local government plans, and other provincial plans within that area. So there will be consideration given to what's there already. And I believe the plan regulations themselves can also set out how that water sustainability plan relates to other plans in the area, whether it may override some of those existing plans, or the regulation can set out how it relates to existing plans already. Did you want to add to that, Oliver?
I guess only to add that I think certainly contemplated would be the source protection plans that are enabled under the Drinking Water Protection Act will be something that could very logically be done in conjunction. If there were ever a scenario where you had both a water sustainability plan, so some sort of trigger being either conflict or problems with the aquatic system, and impacts on a source, a drinking water source, you would see co-development of a plan or very strong linkages between the plan.
Thanks, Oliver and Rosie. So I think we'll move on to our last question now from Kirsty Rendell, and asking, would there be any implications with regard to the process for works in and about a water course? And she has that in brackets. And that's part of Section 9, approvals and notifications in the Water Act. So I'm not sure if that question is too clear. Maybe, Christy, you could clarify in the chat box.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I must admit, I'm sorry.
And we can always follow up with you, Christy, if we can just send you an email if there's some particular thing you have a question about. Okay, so I think with that, we will wrap our question period. Just switch slides here. So thank you to Oliver and Rosie for your expertise shared in your presentations and in our question period today. And thank you to all of you for attending our webinar. We record all of our webinars and house them on our YouTube channel. And the link to our YouTube channel is right there on the slide. You can view all of our archived webinars there. And I'll be circulating the link to this webinar once it's posted online, which will likely be in the next 2 weeks. And as some of you may be aware, we typically do 5 webinars in each Creating a Blue Dialogue season. And as I mentioned in my introduction, this is the 3rd webinar in our 6th season. And our next webinar will take place in March, and we'll explore needs and strategies for strengthening watershed governance in British Columbia. And we'll be finalizing the details of that session in the coming weeks, so stay tuned for details as we circulate that invitation. And for those of you that don't get our webinar invitations and would like to receive them in the future, please just send me a note. My email is ra@polisproject.org, and I can add you to our mailing list. And lastly, I would just like to again foreshadow POLIS's upcoming water issues contest that we're going to be hosting with Canadian Freshwater Alliance. The overview is there on the slide, but as I said in my introduction, Rosie will be circulating the formal invitation in the coming weeks. But if you have any initial questions about the contest, you can contact her at water@polisproject.org. And with that, I think we will wrap today's discussion. So take care, everyone. You'll hear from myself and the WSP team with follow-up resources from this webinar in the next few weeks. So take care.